Today on Blue 58, the Packers have one last preseason game to figure out who's going to be on their initial 53-man roster. How big of a difference will it actually make?
Blue 58!
Hello and welcome to another episode of Blue 58, the one and only podcast of thepowersweep.com. I'm your host, John Meerdink, happy to be with you here for another episode because it is episode number 800. Arbitrary, large, big number. Please celebrate by doing 800 of something today. I don't even know what the 800 things that I'm going to do is yet, but it could be something, or maybe I'll just forget sometime after I record this. Anyway, thanks for listening. 800. Pretty cool. Preseason game number 3 coming down the pike here Saturday afternoon, depending on where you're watching it. Going to be 1 p.m. kickoff for me. Strange time for a football game, 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Well, an NFL football game. For college fans out there, that's very, very standard procedure there. Regardless of when this game is taking place, I want to talk about what we're looking for in this game. And to make it a little bit of a spoiler, I don't actually know. This started out as a what to watch in preseason game number 3 episode. And I'm not actually sure I can do that show. And I'm not actually sure anyone out there can really do that show, if it can exist. If I had to pick one person who could do it, I would bet on maybe Andy Herman from the Pack-A-Day podcast. He's at practice, he's grinding tape. Maybe you can make a really substantive opinion about what Game 3 is going to look like and who really needs to do something in Game 3. But I don't know if it's really about the analyst here because I'm not really sure how much meat there is on the bone here. Let's rewind the clock. It is now April 2024, 4 months ago almost exactly. We have finished up the 2024 NFL Draft. We're feeling good about the Packers draft class. We know all the undrafted free agents, and I sit down to do something we do every year. Maybe it was early May, but you get the idea. Our first roster prediction of 2024. Went back today and I looked at my initial roster sort of construction there and looked through a few of the questions that we have. Do the Packers keep 3 running backs or 4? Do the Packers keep 6 wide receivers or more? And who is the last one, if it's 6 or if it's 7? Who are offensive linemen 8 and 9 and maybe 10 on the roster right now? Do the Packers keep 5 safeties or 4? Most of those questions are still kind of technically unanswered, but I also think that heading into the final preseason game, we basically know who those guys are going to be, and it's basically the same as it was at the end of April and back in early May. So, I think the idea of who's going to make it based on this final preseason game is basically a media creation. Whatever these guys have needed to do up to this point, they've already done. To use an expression that we use a lot in this podcast, the hay is in the barn at this point. The work is basically done. You've got practice today, which is happening or either wrapping up right about now. A little bit of stuff tomorrow. Then the game on Saturday. That's pretty much it. And the real roster questions aren't any more new or different than they were back at the end of the NFL draft and undrafted free agency. Nothing has really changed since then. There's no big injury to change up serious competitions or anything like that. You're really just looking at the kicking battle for a few more live reps, some special team stuff maybe, and the offensive line depth. And chances are you know a lot of that stuff already. You know the answers for those things already. On top of that, we've got to remember that when we're talking about people who could have the third preseason game make some kind of difference for them, we're talking about the fringiest of the fringe guys. The position battle stuff is pretty overrated. Wide receiver 6 last year on the roster was a tie, target-wise, between Bo Melton and Malik Heath. They both got the 6 most targets, 24 apiece. That kind of matters, but it matters a whole lot more who wide receivers 1 through 4 are. And there's never been a competition there this year, and we've known who that top 4 group is the whole time. Christian Watson, Jaden Reed, Dontavian Wicks, Romeo Doubs, in some order. Never been a question, never been a serious threat outside that group, on that group, for any one of those guys. That would be the competition that mattered, and it has never mattered at any point in training camp this year because there's been no serious competition. Last year, 4th running back was Emmanuel Wilson. How many carries did he get in the regular season last year? 14. Beyond that, the running backs carrying the ball were Kenyon Drake and James Robinson. Did you even remember that? I didn't, and I'm the sort of sick person who probably would remember that. I had to look it up. This is the level of roster stuff that we're talking about. Offensive linemen 7 and 8 last year were a tie by snaps on offense were Royce Newman and Sean Ryan. The 9th offensive lineman on this team, one of the positions that we're nominally, quote-unquote, stressing about at this point of the preseason, the 9th offensive lineman on the Packers last year in terms of snaps was David Bakhtiari, who took 55 snaps all of last year. All of them came in week 1. That's the level of player that we're talking about. And I'm not discounting the idea of depth being important. It is. You know that. I know that. It's a staple part of roster building. You want to have the best depth that you can. But you also have to keep in mind what we're talking about here. These are depth guys and fringe guys that are not going to play all that much, if at all. And I like Bo Melton and Malik Heath as much as the next guy, but if they're taking major snaps for this year, for the Packers this year, something has gone wrong. Same thing goes for Emmanuel Wilson. Same thing goes for whoever the 8th, 9th offensive lineman is. If you get to that point, something has gone terribly wrong. I'm not saying that a good player can't come from that group. I think Bo Melton and Malik Heath both fall into that category. They may be some of the exceptions that prove the rule here. But we shouldn't be stretching out a whole lot about what's going to change here in the 3rd preseason games, because the guys who are going to be making moves based on that final preseason game might be getting shuffled off the roster by week 2 or 3 if they even make it that long, because we see that happen every year too. You get to final roster cuts and somebody goes because you just needed that space to be held through cut downs until you sorted something out, or you make a waiver claim and it looks like a guy's going to make it and then a guy wasn't even in camp with the Packers. There's so many different things that can change what happens on the bottom end of the roster between now and week 1, that making it really isn't even hardly making it, and whatever changes based on this final preseason game isn't going to matter a whole lot anyway. So let's talk about a little bit of that depth. Maybe a little bit further up the depth chart, though. There's a couple topics I want to get to here, talking specifically wide receivers and swing tackles here. These are good, I think, preseason topics and things that we should keep in mind as we look at roster construction here. Yojo Mojo asks in the Power Sweeps Discord server, CeeDee Lamb reportedly turned down $33 million per year. Must be nice. The cost for an elite wide receiver seems to be more than what the position offers towards the ultimate team success relative to wins and losses. Green Bay seems to have a dynamic room or quality pass catchers capable of more contributions to team success. Will teams start trending toward something like Green Bay's current approach, or will the league keep handing out stacks of cash to big-name wide receivers? Good question, and I think the answer is appropriately complicated. And I don't think I'm just the one making it complicated. I think I have a tendency to do that. Sometimes when people ask me questions, I feel like maybe sometimes I'm making it more complicated than it is. My wife might say that when she asks, like, who's good on the Packers this year? And then I'll say, start with something like, well, it depends. The thing you have to remember about the Packers is that modern roster construction has its roots in what Vince Lombardi was doing back in the 1960s. You really have to understand the development of what you need from your roster over the time. So it's not really as much saying who's good, and by that point she's walked out of the room, justifiably so. So, looking at this question here, do you want to look for that big-name wide receiver and pay him a lot of money, or build something like the Packers seem to have right now in Green Bay? And I say seem to have for a reason we'll get to here in a second. I think wide receiver, in terms of roster construction, is a both-and situation. It's true, undoubtedly true, that you want to have as many good pass catchers as you possibly can. Having a bunch of good ones helps those players individually be good because they will not be the subject of just intense attention from the opposing defense. And it helps your team be good because you can attack the defense in a whole bunch of different ways. But it's also true that if possible, you get and retain some elite ones, whatever that cost might be, because you want to hang on to your good players if you can. Now, I don't know how much you should pay a good one. That's for someone else to take a crack at. Is $33 million too much for a receiver? It seems like a lot, but the cap's getting bigger every year, and that $33 million per year can have a lot of different things that go into it. Your cap number probably, almost assuredly, isn't going to be that high, so I don't know. Put it this way, to take just one stab at it, if you could pay CeeDee Lamb $100 million over 4 years fully guaranteed, that's just $25 million per year. Maybe that's not that bad of a deal. It's not going to be this utterly ridiculous number, but it also won't have a bunch of fake numbers in it. Your cap number is going to be $25 million per year. Could you do something like that? I don't know. I think we're headed that direction. Just the size of the cap might end up being what drives more guys toward fully guaranteed contracts, just because you've got more space for it and can absorb things when they go badly. So anyway, I don't know how much you should pay a good wide receiver, but having a good one is a really good thing to have, I think, self-evidently. I think we also need to remember that what the Packers have or seem to have in their offensive skill position lineup right now is kind of a happy accident. The Packers have 4 wide receivers they really like, 2 or 3 other guys competing for 5 and 6 on that depth chart, and 2 tight ends they seem to like, all at the same time, all on rookie contracts. That's a pretty rare approach, and it's pretty rare to have all those guys work out at the same time. That is not the typical outcome. If you spent, what is that? It was 3 draft picks in 2022 on Christian Watson, Romeo Doubs, and Samori Toure, then 4 more in 2023, on Jaden Reed, Dontavian Wicks, Luke Musgrave, and Tucker Kraft. Getting 7 guys that you like from 7 draft picks is pretty rare. In most instances, you're going to have significant question marks about one of those guys. And I guess Samori Toure is one of those guys. Grant DuBose for an 8th one there is another guy. And you throw in Malik Heath and Bo Melton, and you see that they like a lot of these guys, but that's not a typical outcome. So as ideal as that might be, trying to plan for something like that is probably not super. It'd be a difficult experiment to replicate, if we want to put it in scientific terms. If you're Brian Gutekunst and you're sitting down and writing a scholarly paper on roster construction, and you're saying, well, my hypothesis is that we want to acquire a whole bunch of good wide receivers. And I did this controlled experiment over 3 years, and I spent a bunch of draft picks and a bunch of undrafted free agents and waiver claims. And wouldn't you know it, I came up with 8 wide receivers that I really like. Well, I don't think there's a lot of teams that would try the same approach and end up with that same outcome. That's good work by Brian Gutekunst and a fair bit of luck there too. So building with that in mind is ideal, but probably not what you want to actually hope for or plan for, put it that way. Another thing we have to remember here, we're sitting in basically year 2 of this group here. A step forward is not guaranteed. We've built a lot of our projections for the Packers this year around the idea that all of their young players are going to take steps forward. Maybe they do, or maybe they don't. Maybe some of them just don't get any better than they were as rookies. Or maybe some of them do improve, but their steps forward are fairly small because they're pretty close to maxed out already. Or maybe somebody gets hurt in such a way that they are never quite the same as a player again. Or maybe somebody breaks away from the group here and decides, I do need to be getting a little bit more money. It's all sunshine and rainbows right now, but is it going to be that way forever with this sort of wide receiver group, this very egalitarian wide receiver group that the Packers have right now? Or maybe something else happens. Or you just so many different ways this group could still be good, but maybe not look as deep a year from now as it looks right now. Or maybe more than one of them takes a step backward. There's a whole bunch of different ways that this could change, and suddenly it starts looking pretty good to have that just one super elite receiver. So to actually answer the question here, I think teams would like to have a bunch of good pass catchers because that keeps your costs down. It is good for your offense. It's good for those guys individually. But I think what's going to ultimately end up happening, even if teams try to replicate what the Packers have apparently done here, is that they're going to end up finding relatively few actually good players and then paying the really good ones to stick around while they try to build around them. That's generally how it works with, large-scale numbers of things. Most tend to not be very good. If you took the bell curve of all the wide receivers drafted since the Packers started acquiring wide receivers and tight ends like this, most of them are going to be near the middle there in that bell curve diagram. A normal distribution of talent is going to land a bunch of guys toward the middle there. And finding guys on the upper end of that bell curve is what you're shooting for. But chances are you're going to find most of them near the middle or lower ends too. That's just how it works. And what the Packers have right now is kind of unique, but I don't know if it's the sort of thing that you could say, yes, this is an actual strategy that we want to try to implement here. Second thing I wanted to talk about, and just as a reminder, if you want to drop these questions in and get them in front of me so that we can talk about them on the podcast, the easiest way to do that is to do it on our Discord server, patreon.com/thepowersweep or thepowersweep.substack.com. Support us either of those places. You can join that conversation with Packers fans from all over the world, all sorts of different dispositions and approaches to the game. You've got stats-oriented people. You've got people just like chill out and enjoy the vibes. You got people who want to look at scouting and film and stuff like that and history, all sorts of different discussions going on in there. And that's one of the benefits that you get when you support Blue 58 and the Power Sweep by visiting either of those two sites. And of course, the links to both of those places are in the show notes as well. Second question I wanted to take a look at today comes from the Jet Sweep guy. He asks, should the Packers have kept Yash Nyman for the same 2-year, $8 million deal the Carolina Panthers gave him? It feels like a solid swing tackle would firm up the roster. It does feel that way, doesn't it? In a vacuum, yes, I think that's something they absolutely should have done. $8 million over 2 years for a guy that you think can be a spot starter for you is chump change for a decent tackle. You think a guy's good, $8 million over 2 years is nothing. Right now, and this is even going to change because other guys will jump ahead of him, $4 million per year in terms of average annual value puts Nyman into a tie for 54th in the NFL among tackles alone. So not just offensive linemen, just among tackles. That's almost outside the starting ranks for, like if every team is starting 2 tackles, that gives you 64 tackles. He's almost outside the top 64. Crazy. Outside of that vacuum, though, it gets a little bit squishier. The first and biggest question is, does Yash Nyman still want to be in Green Bay? Think about it from his perspective. Maximizing his career earnings is going to depend on him starting. He's going to hit free agency here in a couple years again. So he's got to go a place where he can show that he can be a capable starter. Again, he's a little bit in a career rebuild sort of state right now. If he wants a chance to do that, if he wants a chance to be on the field regularly, he's got to go somewhere other than Green Bay. And on top of that, does he want to stick around in a place that actively tried to replace him for basically an entire year? Maybe not. The second question you have to ask is he actually good? A contract like that is absolutely worth a roll of the dice for Carolina. We did a series of bonus content for supporters for Patreon and Substack over the last month or so about fixing the Carolina Panthers. And one of the things that we talked about is how they have to buy time in the short term. They're in a long-term rebuild here. It's going to take 2 or 3 years for sure because, for one thing, they've been in dire cap straits. They've lost all their draft capital. Their roster is decrepit. They need to add talent, and they need to figure out how to do that for the long term. But in the short term, since David Tepper, their owner, is so impatient and keeps firing people left, right, and center, you need to show in the short term that you're doing some things and making some progress. And the way that you do that is hitting on a few cheap free agent contracts and getting some rookies that can contribute right away. A contract like the Panthers gave Yash Nyman is a great way to do that. But it is a roll of the dice. What is that roll of the dice getting you, or what are the chances that dice roll comes up good for you? Pro Football Focus grades aren't everything, but let's just look at his grades over the past few years. How many times in the past few years has Yash Nyman graded at a 70 or higher, according to Pro Football Focus? Well, in 2023, over 15 games, that number was 3. 3 games where he graded at a 70+. In 2022, over 17 games, including playoffs, same including playoffs for 2023 as well. It was also 3 games, only 3 games with a grade of 70 or higher. In 2021, I thought would be much higher than this. Out of 10 games, just 1 with a grade of 70 or higher. For comparison, Rasheed Walker had 3 out of 15 games where he had enough snaps on offense to justify a grade, where he got a 70 or higher. So roughly the same. But for further comparison, Zach Tom in 2022 had 70-plus grades in 3 out of 9 games and then 8 out of 19 games in 2023. So basically about as good, maybe a little less if you drill down a little further and look at pass blocking versus run blocking, overall performance, stuff like that. Maybe a little bit less than Rasheed Walker, in the neighborhood there. That seems okay for a swing tackle. So where does that put us, I think? Back at number 1. Does Yash Nyman want to be in Green Bay? I think the answer is no, unless he had a realistic chance of starting. And that's what it comes down to. Was there ever a realistic chance that he would start in Green Bay this year? I think the answer is a firm no. The Packers, first and foremost, let him walk for relatively cheap. They certainly were aware of the kind of deals he was getting, or certainly had an idea of what they thought he could get on the open market, and they weren't interested in paying that. Packers also signed Andre Dillard ahead of the NFL draft for cheaper than they're paying Yash Nyman. Again, I think that tells you what they think of Yash Nyman. And then they draft Jordan Morgan, a tackle, in the first round, but then don't even bother trying to play him at tackle in training camp. If the Packers aren't going to play their 2044 first-round pick at the same position at tackle, instead choosing to play Rasheed Walker and Zach Tom there, what do you think are the real chances that Yash Nyman could have unseated either Tom or Walker in 2024? They just did not exist. So in a vacuum, yeah, a guy like Yash Nyman would have been great to have. In this particular circumstance, I don't think there was a realistic chance that he was going to stay in Green Bay this year. I want to wrap up by talking about something I was only made aware of thanks to a post at acmepackingcompany.com. Paul Noonan wrote about playing football outside. This has apparently been a topic in some online discourse recently, and it's kind of funny to me that this is even a topic that anybody has to weigh in on, preferring to see football played outside, but apparently it is, and so I wanted to throw my 2 cents in. My football manifesto, if and when I write it, is going to include a chapter called Football is to be played outside on grass. That is how football should be played. And here are some reasons why. First and foremost, and I don't like to bring this up, but I asked God himself. He said, yes, that football is supposed to be played that way. I asked, he confirmed. It was weird that he chose to weigh in on that outside of all the other things that I've asked him over the years. But this is the one that he, opened up the heavens and said, this is it. Football's supposed to be outside. So you can take that to the bank. This is the divine right, when God bestowed the game of football on Vince Lombardi in Green Bay, Wisconsin when it was invented. That's what he said. And he's just reaffirmed that to me recently. I'm tongue-in-cheek for this one. The real ones does kind of go along that line. First, playing football outside honors the history of the game. Football has been an outside game from when it started, and it needs to be played that way because that is how it was designed to be played. That's how it started. That's how it should continue. In philosophy, you would refer to this as a Chesterton's fence situation or a Chesterton's gate situation. Posited by the thinker and writer G.K. Chesterton, the description of that problem basically goes, if you come across a fence on your land or something like that, or anywhere, and you don't know why it's there, don't take it down until you know why it is there, because chances are someone put it there for a reason at a specific time in a specific place, and there are still reasons why it's there, so don't go changing it until you understand why it's there in the first place. Football is meant to be played outside because it's part of the culture of the game. Football is a game about taking land. Basically, it's I don't like the football is war sort of thing, but there are games that are designed to simulate that sort of physical engagement. It's about taking territory or advancing through territory strategically in teamwork and stuff like that. There are a lot of parallels, and that was part of the reason games like football were created. And that's designed to be played outside because that's where those sort of combat-adjacent situations take place. It happens outside. It's supposed to be outside. Third, playing outside is a reminder that stats don't matter. There are only 4 actual numbers in football. We talk about yards, passer rating, completion percentage, yards per carry, EPA, DVOA, all sorts of different stats and ways that you can slice the game, but there's actually only 4 numbers in football: down, distance, time, and score. 5 if you want to count the play clock, though that's just an abstraction of the time. If you're worried about playing the game outside, throwing off stats, please unplug your brain from fantasy football because the stats do not matter. They are just ways that we measure the game. They do not actually matter to the game itself because the only thing that matters at the end is who won and who lost, who scored the most points. A highly successful football coach in Green Bay once said that stats are for losers. This is one situation where I really strongly agree with Mike McCarthy because I think stats have overwhelmed this game. But playing outside where non-football stuff affects the football and changes the stats is a reminder of the core of football, which is playing the game outside and just getting the points and winning the game. A bad weather game turns any given week into a playoff game because it doesn't matter if you won ugly. It doesn't matter your yards per attempt. It doesn't matter your this, that, or the other thing. It just matters, did you win or did you not win? This is something that has frustrated me about being like a stat-minded person about a lot of things. We've had a lot of discussion over the years about Aaron Rodgers' performance statistically in playoff games. There are games that you can point to where Aaron Rodgers played really well, and he did play really, really well. Did it matter? No, because the Packers' defense played really poorly. And so you can point to all these great postseason stats that Aaron Rodgers had, and maybe even had in games where the stats were deceiving, but it ultimately didn't matter because the Packers lost. But there are also games where Aaron Rodgers' stats weren't very good, but the Packers ended up winning, and all that mattered was that they won. Go back and look at the 2010 NFC Championship game just as a for instance. Rodgers' stats in that game are not great. Had a pretty ugly interception in there too, down in the red zone, and only managed to snag Brian Urlacher by a shoelace and prevent what would have been one of the all-time terrible plays in Packers postseason history. Instead, the Packers defense hangs on. B.J. Raji does the thing that B.J. Raji does. We've all seen it a billion times. Go look it up one more time just for fun today. Pause the podcast. Do it right now. Go see B.J. Raji score a touchdown. It's going to make your day better, I promise. If you're a Bears fan and you're listening to it, do it anyway. But those sorts of things are what matter because the Packers ultimately got the win. It doesn't matter what anybody's stats were. It mattered that the Packers won. There are even playoff games where you can say that you played pretty well, but if you lose, it doesn't matter how well you played. Over a season-long sort of performance, it might make you feel better about the construction of your team or this, that, and the other thing. But in the playoffs, it only matters if you win or you lose. It doesn't matter how well you played in a playoff loss. And that, I think, is adjacent to playing in bad weather. The point is to win the game. It's not how well you win the game or the way in which you win the game. It's whether or not you win the game. I feel a little bit like Herm Edwards here. Hello, you play to win the game. You play in the weather, in the sunshine, in whatever, but you just got to win. Fourth, playing football inside costs us some of the best football. Refer again to Paul Noonan's piece. This is a point that he made and I think made very well. If you play inside, yes, you do miss some of the really bad weather games. And I think bad weather games are overrated. Cold weather is not that big of a deal. Rain is not that big of a deal. Snow is not that big of a deal. But if you don't like that bad weather, that's fine. But moving all games inside also means that you're going to miss the really good weather games. You will never have a beautiful, immaculate, crisp fall day playing football in a dome. You will never experience that. Not even one where the roof opens. It's different. Playing outside in the wind under a just immaculate blue sky in late September, early October, a noon kickoff, an afternoon game, especially maybe an afternoon game where it starts getting a little bit cold in the fourth quarter, you will never experience that playing in a dome. But playing outside, you will get to experience some of the best experiences you can have as a sports fan in a beautiful environment. 2009 season, I believe it was 2009. Might have been it was 2009. Packers opened up against the Chicago Bears on Sunday Night Football in Lambeau Field. Just a beautiful late summer night, September. Even if the Packers had lost, I would always remember that day just because of how nice outside it was. You could never replicate that experience in a dome. It just isn't the same. And you're missing out on some amazing experiences by moving all of the games inside. That loss aversion to the bad stuff takes away some of the good stuff too. Finally, and this is kind of a squishy point here, but I find that football is more beautiful when it's messy. I think there's a lot of beauty in football. It is a brutal, violent game that often cripples its participants for life. Let's be real about it. But there's a lot of beauty there too. The teamwork, the individual strength and effort, just the kind of like almost primal glory of seeing athletic feats be achieved. Seeing a guy run at absolute full speed or move somebody who's bigger than him or just a violent collision in a gap. And part of that, I think, is magnified by the elements. Man versus man is great football. Man versus elements is another great bit of beautiful football. In fiction writing terms, you'd call it a man versus God conflict. That is cool stuff. You just can't have that playing inside. And that, I think, is a beautiful part of the game that should never go away. Ultimately, I think playing football inside, you lose more than you gain. And I'm glad that the Packers play outside. They should never play inside. Anybody who suggests putting a roof on Lambeau Field should be excommunicated from the fandom. And I will argue with anybody who says otherwise, that putting a roof on Lambeau Field is as close to blaspheming the Green Bay Packers as you could ever come for something that isn't divine. And you should play football outside because that's where it belongs, and that's when the game is the best. And that's my take. So that's all I've got for you in this episode of Blue 58. I appreciate you listening in. I would appreciate it even more as I throw off my own rhythm here by saying one slightly different word. I'd appreciate it even more if you'd take a second and share this episode with someone you think would enjoy it, because that's going to get more people involved in this conversation you and I are having about the Green Bay Packers, which in turn is going to help all of us, me included, become smarter Packers fans. And as I always say, smarter Packers fans are better Packers fans, and better Packers fans are what we all want to be. I'm your host, John Meerdink. We'll see you next time on Blue 58.